I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close-Up. The 2020 presidential election is 606 days away, and at this early stage, the dance card on the Democratic side is quickly filling up, although almost as many candidates are leaving the field as entering. Where do we stand right now, and what will the impact mean for local candidates and issues specific to New York? Joining us today are Trip Gabriel, national correspondent for the New York Times, and Eleanor Randolph, contributing writer for the Times. Let's talk first about the fact that this week there seem to be more people leaving the race than getting into the race. And Eleanor, Mayor Bloomberg, former Mayor Bloomberg, at the top of that list. Did we think he was going to run or not?
You know, a couple of months ago, I thought it was possible before a lot of these other people got into the race. I think I wouldn't be surprised if Bloomberg talked to Joe Biden and realized that Biden was going to get into this race, and that if Biden got in, that center path would be divided if Bloomberg got in there. And so he has said, and his people have said from the beginning, that the one thing he wants, the eye on the prize right now, is getting rid of Trump. And so he's going to, not only is he going to put money in, he's going to put a ton of money in. They're talking about as much as $500 million, and if they're talking about that, I'm sure it's more. He's worth $55 billion. So, but they're also putting together a sort of analytics team, you know, and I mean, this is a guy who made money in data, and so he's trying to put together something that will help the feeble Democrats in the data field, and that would be that could be very helpful.
Well, let me ask: does he think that Biden has a better chance of getting elected than he would?
I don't really know what his thinking is, but I think the people around him think that Biden, first of all, Biden is doing better in the polls than Bloomberg. Bloomberg has some baggage that he would have trouble with in the primary. You know, I mean, the stop and frisk stuff in the city, and some of the Me Too questions about his friends and things like that. So I think Biden, if Biden wants to do this, I think the fact that Bloomberg is sitting there ready to support him, and maybe that's why Sherrod Brown, the senator from Ohio, got out. Maybe he knows too that Biden is the centrist candidate.
Trip, what do you think? Do we want a centrist candidate? There certainly seems to be a lot of noise coming from the left this year.
I just came back from Pennsylvania, which, as everybody remembers, was one of the three blue wall states in 2016 that went for Donald Trump, and is the primary reason he's in the White House today. So it is a swing state. It's Joe Biden's native state, and there's a huge trepidation among sort of establishment Democrats and even just average voters in Pennsylvania that a hard left candidate is not the right candidate for Democrats to nominate to win back Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, which are the three states that Trump won by a total of less than 80,000 votes in 2016, and really represent Democrats' best promise for defeating Trump in 2020, at this point at least, in terms of the electoral map. And there's a fear that if it's a Bernie Sanders or an Elizabeth Warren who is the nominee, that even though that there's a lot of grassroots energy among progressives and among liberals, and we certainly see that in Congress right now on policy issues, that it's going to make it a lot harder to win back the folks who flipped from being pretty good Democrats to voting for Donald Trump, and there were no small number of them across the Midwest. So a Biden or a Sherrod Brown or an Amy Klobuchar, the Minnesota senator, who's also an announced candidate, are, right now, Brown is out, but those are the potential candidates, a week ago who would be in the moderate lane, and so that lane is still very, very open, and it's a little bit of a kind of a political cliche to talk about these lanes. There's not a very specific, hard line between who's where you fit in terms of your ideology, but there's a major opportunity there for Democrats, and I think that Brown's decision not to run is a bigger surprise to me than Bloomberg.
Do you really, do people in Pennsylvania or anywhere in the country really think the Democrats are going to ban hamburgers, do more things like reject the Amazon deal, as happened in Queens? Are they really concerned that the country is going to shift that far left if the Democrats win?
I think they're afraid that that the Democrats, some Democrats, have handed this easy line of attack to Trump and the Republicans right now. The Green New Deal, which wasn't going to ban hamburgers, but became, is a huge, wish list of very far left kind of social policies that immediately made it easy to slam Democrats, as being a party of socialists and pie in the sky, impractical folks, and they're afraid that that's a very potent attack. And certainly Republican strategists in these swing states, would be happiest running against a candidate like that.
Where were we at this point 4 years ago? Who was ahead, who wasn't, and what does it say about our prognostication at this point?
Well, I think when you look back 4 years in any presidential cycle, the first thing you have to do is rip up the polls that you're looking at now. I mean,
That's exactly
it's
right.
completely irrelevant. 4 years ago, Hillary Clinton was leading all other candidates in the Democratic primary by 50 points. And I guess the leading Republican candidates in what was even then a big field, a field of more than a dozen candidates, kind of tantamount or analogous to the Democratic field today. Jeb Bush and Scott Walker were the top two candidates, and Trump was, not really on many people's radar at all. He hadn't announced, in the spring.
Yeah, I mean, look, we were still predicting Hillary Clinton the day before the election. So, I just think it's a time for surprises. And I think, looking at this Democratic field, I just keep thinking that maybe there's somebody who hasn't gotten in there yet, and, like Michael Bennet in Colorado.
Besides Joe Biden and Howard Schultz.
Yes. Well, Schultz, is talking about running as a third party.
Right.
And that is going to be one of the really interesting things to see. I mean, if you look at some of these states that went for Trump, the Green Party almost took out I've often wondered about these third parties, about who funds that third party, who is looking at how you can draw the votes away from, your opponent. And so that will be, I don't know whether he's really going to run as an independent, but that, to me, that will be crazy for the Democrats.
Is there any way to persuade him not to?
Just don't drink Starbucks coffee, I guess. That's about it.
Well, one boycott. Do we have any sense as to how the field is shaping up now, Trip?
Well, I think, there's, even though I just said rip up the polls, I think, there's a few people that, are gathered a lot more interest among voters, and, certainly have Biden and Bernie Sanders. Sanders, since he announced, has had some rallies in New York here, of course, and then in Chicago, and he drew huge crowds. The Sanders, supporters are still there, from what I can tell, in large numbers. I think of the much lesser known candidates who have announced, Kamala Harris, the California senator, is probably the breakout star among that crowd of folks. Just a very interesting background as a former attorney general in San Francisco, a lead prosecutor, so she has that law enforcement background, and she represents a younger, demographic that's very typical of what's driving the momentum and the excitement in the Democratic base, and which we just saw in the midterm elections in November. So she has that, and I think a wild card that we haven't mentioned is Beto O'Rourke, who seems to be leaning toward getting in. He's the former Texas congressman, of course, who almost knocked off Ted Cruz in the Senate race last year, and an interesting candidate as a personality. Is hard to characterize ideologically. Is not a a hard left, in quote, air quote, socialist type of candidate, has shown that he can, attract voters who are more in the middle.
Do you think Pete Buttigieg has any possibility?
Thank you for saying his name, because even though this is my business, I still can't do that.
Well, in all seriousness, will voters vote for someone whose name they can't pronounce?
I don't know. He calls himself Mayor Pete,
I know, with good reason.
But, he's a fascinating guy.
Yes.
He's gay. I just wondered if if
He's gay and young.
and smart as a whip, you
Yep.
know, and but I don't know whether the country's ready for a gay president. It would be, we've now had a black president. We've now had
Not a woman yet, though.
no woman yet,
I wouldn't discount anybody because of their identity. I think, one of the lessons of 2016 and also of 2012 and 28 was, nobody thought a African American
Right.
whose middle name was, whose
Hussein.
name was Barack Hussein Obama, was electable, and certainly nobody thought Donald Trump was electable. Voters in both cases went for, to use the cliche, an authentic candidate, someone who they believed, when he spoke, even if he wasn't telling the truth in Trump's case, but who conveyed that, he had a message and he was very confident about it and connected with, groups of voters that.
fake believability.
Right?
Yeah.
We've looked at that national slate. Let's look at the impact the election will have on New York when we come back. And we're back with Trip Gabriel and Eleanor Randolph of the New York Times. We're still talking about the 2020 election, of course. A lot of New York candidates in this, even though Michael Bloomberg has ruled himself out. Are any of these candidates, Kirsten Gillibrand for one, real contenders? We, sort of have this micro look at them as New Yorkers. What do people around the country think?
I think there's very little name recognition for Senator Gillibrand, and if you go to Ohio or South Carolina, there's been some polling, and we were talking about Mayor Pete from South Bend, is it?
Yeah.
South Bend, Indiana, a moment ago, and these are the single-digit candidates, or maybe even the below 5% candidates.
Like Trump was at this point.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. That is, Iowa gets a lot of criticism that's justified, but one of the advantages of the state is it's only 3 million people, and after campaigning there for a year, everybody in the state will have a chance to have met you, and so if you don't have a lot of money or name recognition, you do have a shot.
And speaking of South Carolina, Bill de Blasio is scheduled to be there this weekend. Does anybody care?
Well, he does, obviously, and I was going to say, you've got de Blasio, who is, circling madly, saying, notice me, in Iowa and South Carolina. And then, you have to wonder whether Cuomo, he said that he was not going to run, but he's just itching to jump into this race, and I guess he's not going to run. But who knows? If it's not too late, he might be just trying to figure out whether or not he can ride New York to become vice president or something like that. I just can't believe he's not in the mix.
Well, how would he when he said so unequivocally that he won't run?
Well, it's like the old British Chancellor of the Exchequer. They're going to have to carry him up to the podium and make him vice president or something like that.
Well, he didn't say he wouldn't run for vice president.
No, he didn't mention that at
That's
all.
true.
So I don't know. Gillibrand, I've watched her on television. She doesn't project. There's not it's not like Beto O'Rourke or Kamala Harris. You don't feel the emotion from her the way you do some of these other candidates. And my suspicion is you have to be able to energize that crowd. And I don't know whether she can do it.
This may seem like a silly question, but why is Chuck Schumer not in this mix at all? This is not quite a rhetorical question, but go ahead.
I think it's an excellent question. I mean, every senator and probably every congressperson at this point looks in the mirror and sees a future president. And but it's a good question. Schumer, his name never surfaces, except maybe in his own family, but not among Democratic leadership. I mean, and I also think he loves his job. I mean, he doesn't love being the minority leader. He would love to, be the majority leader at some point again. But
well, you have to put your hand up, and I don't think he's ever really done that. I don't think he's ever said, "I really yearn to be president," and maybe he does, as you say, at the family gatherings, but he's never really put himself out there in that way, and he's really an expert on legislation, and he
Which is what he's done all his life.
All his life, and it's such a different skill set to be a manager, to run a country. So
Speaking of New Yorkers who have sort of leapt into prominence, Jerry Nadler
Wow.
on the Judiciary Committee.
he really has. Well, 81 people he wants to interview. I think that's really fascinating. He's going to be very, very busy. I mean, and he sounds as though he's working up to impeachment. That's what it sounds like to me. He's almost said it a couple of times, and I don't know whether that's wise, but I do think that's kind of where he seems to be headed.
But very, if I can use the word judiciously, he has not made a big fuss about it beforehand. And politically, Trip and Eleanor, does that make sense? Or if the Democrats want to defeat Donald Trump, is it wiser to do it at the polls rather than through impeachment in Congress?
I think they're doing a both paths strategy right now,
That's right.
and they're gonna. We don't know what exactly is going to be in the Mueller report. We don't know how much of the detailed information is ever going to be made public. But by call it a fishing expedition, by calling in almost all the same witnesses and seeking all the same kinds of documents, the Democratic majority in the House will have an opportunity, basically, to have another opportunity to air all this information, and and if it leads toward impeachment, they have to satisfy the very angry progressive base that is calling for impeachment. At the same time, you see obviously Nancy Pelosi is not calling for impeachment. She has to, she a much more practical mission, and they can drag it out for the next 2 years, the next year and a half, and and let it still be a decision made at the polls.
And obviously a lower standard of proof, and different charges can be placed rather than criminal charges.
That's right. I mean, what I find fascinating is all this brouhaha that Trump is going to run again because he doesn't want to be indicted by the New York prosecutors.
So he would be immune from criminal charges if he's president.
Yes. Well,
He can't be president forever, though, right?
well, let's hope not.
Still have a constitution.
Yeah, so far.
Whoever is the next president, if it's Donald Trump or some successor, there's still a lot of issues on the table that will affect New York. The tax deduction, whether that gets back on the table or not, the Gateway Tunnel, housing, the Housing Authority, for one thing. We signed an agreement with the Housing Authority that gives New York City nothing. Mass transit, which we certainly could use money for. Immigration, an issue of great concern to New Yorkers. Will it make any difference if the Democrats regain power?
I think, of course, it will. Yeah, I mean, all those things you mentioned are Democratic policy priorities, and whether it's immigration or transportation or taxation and climate change, which is now this is from at this point this is going to be an election that in the Democratic field it's very much about climate change.
Right.
It was never mentioned in 2016, at least at the presidential debate level, and I think a lot of that. Energy is coming from a place like New York.
It seems to me that Trump and some of the Republicans have really sort of taken a certain amount of revenge against New York in New York State with the tax plan and things like that. And Schumer said the other day that that Trump was holding out the money for Gateway. You know, this goes underneath the Hudson River, and the tunnels that are there are 100 years old plus. And so that Trump is holding out on that for some sort of future negotiation. I mean, I could be wrong, but I think a Democratic president would be much more amenable to putting money into that sort of infrastructure.
Did Schumer say what Trump wants to negotiate about?
I don't know, you know.
Not necessarily a New York issue, or?
I don't know whether he said exactly. Maybe I haven't heard exactly. Just that he said that it was he was holding it back as an ace in his sleeve.
And what about even if the Democrats don't take the presidency, what is the likelihood that they would get control of both houses of Congress?
I think the Senate has to be still considered a long shot. I mean, the map is much more favorable than it was in last year in 2018. If Trump is reelected, you have to assume he's going to take a lot of these states that have close Senate races, Maine and North Carolina and Iowa. I mean, those are three of the most vulnerable Republican seats. So if he wins the White House, he probably will. Those three senators will probably be reelected. Maybe even Cory Gardner in Colorado, another vulnerable one. The House is a much more interesting question. I mean, obviously we've seen a complete change with a Democratic majority. You know, suddenly Democrats are on the march in terms of policy and in terms of investigations, but the left wing of the party forgets that the reason they have a Democratic majority in the House is because they flipped 40 seats that Republicans held, and most of those were in districts that Donald Trump carried, or the Republicans, held at least. And if there's a wave that returns Donald Trump to the House, a lot of those moderate kind of red to blue districts could easily flip back.
Which goes back to your point of it becomes very important who they nominate and who's at the top of that ticket.
Right.
And whether that person drives people away or drives people to the rest of the Democratic ticket. Mm-hmm. Thanks to Trip Gabriel and to Eleanor Randolph for giving us that update on the 2020 election. And I'll have some additional thoughts on CODA next about Mayor Bloomberg. Before he declared his candidacy in 2001, Mike Bloomberg was asked why he would want to be mayor. "Because everybody tells me that you can't do it," he replied. "Did I want to risk an embarrassing and costly failure? Absolutely," he said. "Happiness for me has always been the thrill of the unknown, trying something that everyone says can't be done. Feeling that gnawing pit in my stomach that says, danger ahead." So, whether you hoped he would or not, that might leave you wondering why he decided this week not to run for president in 2020. He said he would have beaten Donald Trump, which might well have been true. He said he could have brought the parties together. Since he's been both a Democrat and a Republican, that's also plausible. He listed some of the challenges that he said he knew how to fix, two of which, in good conscience, perhaps he should have overlooked. Homelessness, which his mayoral administration didn't really reduce, and protecting every citizen's right to vote, which he neglected to do when he browbeat the city council into overturning the referendum on term limits so he could run again. In 2016, he had considered running as an independent, but the odds were daunting. The last time a third-party candidate bumped either a Democrat or a Republican from second place, much less from first, was when Teddy Roosevelt, running as the Progressive Party candidate, came in second behind Woodrow Wilson in 1912. Bloomberg also wisely calculated that he would draw even more votes from Hillary Clinton than she was already losing, and would elect Donald Trump. This time he was more confident of winning the election than the nomination. The Democratic presidential field is already almost as crowded as last week's ballot for public advocate in New York. which meant Bloomberg might have gotten by a gaggle of progressives, but probably not nominated if another moderate like Joe Biden also decides to run. Last year, Bloomberg proved how much power he could wield without becoming a candidate. He spent $100 million supporting Democrats in the midterm elections. At least 21 of the 24 candidates he bankrolled were elected. The calculus in 2016 was whether his candidacy would have done any harm. In 2020, it seems to be more of a question of whether his time and his money could be better spent. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I am Sam Roberts.